So today is our fourth and final week together in the topic of cultivating Christian mindfulness. And I would like to begin in the same way that we have each week. And I'd like you let's take about 30 seconds and just be still. And I'd like to read from this passage from Psalm 46. So just find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let's take a few breaths. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Be. Amen. So what I'd like to do today is a little different in that I would like for us to start with a 5-minute formal practice. And it's the practice of the third set of Christian mindfulness practices that I hope to introduce. Christian Zen. And then I'd like to go over some general guidelines, sort of to pull these three together along with other meditation or mindfulness contemplative practices that you may have experience with. And then I'd like to spend a little time talking about a model for thinking about both health-related mindfulness practices oriented towards physical and mental health, and specifically Christian mindfulness, and hopefully bring those two together. And then we'll close by just going over some additional resources that might be of interest to you. So any comments or questions before we begin? Okay. Christian Zen originated, or I guess it's a synthesis that began by the experience of Jesuit priests who went from the West to Japan in the 1950s and 60s in order to teach. Many of them went to the town of Kamakura, and there they had experience with the Japanese practice of Zen. Jesuits tend to be quite open to spiritual practices and other traditions, and I had one Jesuit priest say to me, "We went to teach, and we stayed to learn." The practice of Zen, the word Zen in Japanese comes from the Chinese word Chan, which comes from the Sanskrit word dhyana, and it simply means meditation. Zen is a 1,200-year-old tradition, and the primary means of instruction in Zen is experience. It is an entirely experiential-based practice. Teachers will generally explain how to sit to students and then tell them just sit. The focus in Zen and in Christian Zen is on the breath and sensations of the body. And of course, the way we experience breath is by body sensations. The feel of the breath going through our nostrils, the rise and fall of our chest, the rise and fall of our abdomen. So Zen has very little um, dependence on Buddhist, of course, it comes from the Buddhist tradition, but it has very little dependence on Buddhist teachings. And I think because of that, it was not a stretch for the Jesuit priests to experience it, to fold this into their existing framework of theology and liturgy. Um, Probably the simplest and easiest explanation of Zen is a book entitled Zen for Christians, written first in about 2003 and updated a couple of years ago by a woman named Kim Boykin, who is a graduate of the Candler School of Theology at Emory and is now teaching in New York. It's a very stepwise book. I recommend it if it's something of interest to you. So I'd like for us to try a 5-minute exercise in Christian Zen. And the way we'll practice, and this may look very familiar to you because it's very similar to what we did the first week. It's a practice of following the breath. So I would invite you to sit still. It helps to have your feet flat on the ground. What is different from the other two traditions that we've practiced is in Zen, usually the eyes are only closed part way, with the gaze down at about a 45-degree angle without focusing on anything. The reason for this is several-fold. First, Zen is a practice that tries to bridge between what might be considered inward and outward focus. So we practice with our eyes part open because we live with our eyes open. The second reason is that some teachers will say it's more difficult to fall asleep with your eyes slightly open. This has been my practice for the past 15 years, and I will guarantee you that it is quite possible to find yourself dozing off with your eyes partly open. There's no trouble to that at all, but there it is nonetheless. Now, in this exercise, if you find that that's uncomfortable, feel free to close your eyes. That's not a problem. And then again, as we did the first week, bring your attention to the breath wherever you experience it most strongly. That may be your nostrils, it may be in the throat, you may feel it in your chest, you may feel it in the rise and fall of your abdomen. And breathe normally. Don't try to control the breath in any way. And when the mind wanders, as it surely will, you just gently bring it back to the breath. So if some of those instructions sound familiar, they're basically the same way of handling thoughts that we did in Christian meditation and in centering prayer. Not trying to fight it when the mind wanders, because that's what minds do. Any questions or comments before we try this for 5 minutes? Okay. I don't hear anything. Any questions or comments? Let me just check. I have to scroll through. I can't see everybody on the screen, so I'm sort of scrolling through. All right. Okay, and as we've done before, I'll start the bell timer. If you haven't already muted yourself, I would ask you to do that so that the sounds of a chair moving perhaps aren't heard by others. And we'll start. This bell should ring 3 times at the beginning of the 5 minutes and then 3 times at the end. So we will begin. Just slowly let yourself shift back, let your eyes refocus, and come back into the here and now. So would anyone like to share anything they noticed during that time? How that experience was for you? Any comments? Yeah, Jenny.
As somebody who has meditated for a long time, but always with my eyes closed, it was this half open, half closed was a real challenge. It was very tempting just to, so you said, oh, you can close them if you want, but it was like, well, no, the point of this is learning and experimenting with new things. But that for me was a big challenge.
Sure.
And so initially, at least, distracting. So I'm curious as how long it would take for me to be able to do that without it being a distraction.
I think that's very understandable that it would. Usually, I find it helpful to, when I practice with my eyes partly open, to sit in a place where there's not much right in front of me that would be distracting. Maybe a very plain, clean. I have a small altar where I sit, and there's very little on it. A candle, not much more. So there's not a whole lot for my eyes to focus on, and
Right.
I find that helpful.
And for me, it wasn't so much distracted by what I saw, because I was just staring at a blank part of my desk. It was a more internal distraction of trying to have my eyes half open and half closed and what to focus. I mean, it was much more internal. Sure. Yeah, for me. But that's meditation. It's always the internal distractions.
I think the instruction would just be, those are thoughts. Notice them. They're just more thoughts, and if they continue, just say, thinking, or noticing distraction. However, whatever label would be appropriate. But anybody else? Okay. Okay, I'm going to continue on then.
I just have one other question, just in general. So what is the difference between Zen and Christian Zen?
To me, it's the intention. The intention, at least my intention, is to draw closer to God. Okay. To be more and more aware of the presence of God at every moment in my life. So for me, that is the intention. I think probably most Buddhists would not use that theistic language. Buddhists who practice, most Zen students would probably not use that particular language. But at least that would be my how I would describe it.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Okay. I'm going to come back again to that definition of Christian mindfulness, the practice of paying prayerful attention in the present moment to God's abundant life. So Jenny, in answer to your question, one response might be that for a Christian Zen practitioner, the question would be, is this helping me pay prayerful attention in the present moment to the presence of God, the presence of the divine? If someone said no to that, then it's the wrong practice for them, certainly. All three of the practices that we've talked about I would say have this as their ultimate end, paying prayerful attention in the present moment to God, to God's presence in our life. James Finley was a student of Thomas Merton's for 6 years at the Abbey of Gethsemane when he was there. Finley's now in his 70s. He now works with Richard Rohr. Some of you may be familiar with Richard Rohr. He has written a number of books on contemplative prayer, and in particular, the connection between contemplative prayer and action in the world. And Finley has written a book entitled Christian Meditation, Experiencing the Presence of God. And this is taken from that book, and they're just general guidelines for Christian meditation. So I would hope that you could see the application from all three of the methods that we've been talking about. And those were just three of, there are several others, which we haven't had time to talk about, but they all are similar. So in general, it helps for the body to be sitting still, of course, with the back straight. That helps keep us alert. To breathe naturally, not to force the breath, not to try to have it be one way or the other, fast or slow. And again, this says the eyes closed or half closed and unfocused. The other two meditation methods we talked about have the eyes closed. Usually in Christian Zen, it's half closed and unfocused. The mind, the hope is, the attention is to be present, to be open, and to be awake. And neither to try to have particular thoughts, nor to try not having thoughts. And both are particularly important, particularly, I think, for many of us from a Christian tradition where prayer generally involves a particular way of thinking, either verbalized, either spoken prayer or simply internal prayer, having a series of thoughts. That's not the focus of Christian contemplative meditation. And also not try, I've got too many no's in there. Not to try not having thoughts. The mind thinks, that's what it does. The thoughts are going to be there. And simply be aware of them as they arise, come into being, and then pass by. In centering prayer, Thomas Keating has often used the analogy of boats floating down a river. And you're sitting on the bank and watching the thoughts pass as they float along, just like boats on the river. But when you notice that you've hopped onto one of the boats and you're happily thinking away, then you bring yourself back off the boat to the bank. And in centering prayer, you do that through the use, as we mentioned, of a sacred word. The attitude that Finley says is so important is just non-judgmental compassion towards yourself. What we notice as we sit is our tendency to attach ourselves to some thoughts that are pleasant and to push away other ones that are unpleasant, be they thoughts, bodily sensations, experiences of pain, tweaks in the muscles that we try to push away. We do that all the time, attaching and pushing away. And the flip side of that is to try to have non-judgmental compassion for everybody else, because we're all in this together. We all do it all the time. So maybe the key words in attitude are non-judgmental compassion. Finley suggests to, if possible, try to establish a daily practice. I've been practicing in all three of these traditions for about 35 years. And I started with the Christian meditation tradition. I would practice a couple of days a week for 5, 6, 8 minutes, and then I'd put it aside. And then 2 or 3 times, and then put it aside, over and over and over. And gradually, it took me a long time to reach a point where I was practicing every day. He suggests a goal of 20 to 30 minutes for really any of these practices. And again, if you start and 2 minutes is all you can manage for whatever reason, that's great. That's a beginning. Generally, people find that 20 to 30 minutes is a good compromise between busy schedules and how long it takes to sort of settle in. It helps to have a consistent location, to find a place where it's quiet, preferably without a lot of distractions around you. Choose it carefully. You might try, if you're interested, try different places. See what seems to be comfortable for you. And it helps to have a routine, to start and end the same way. Some people begin with a prayer or a passage from a scripture. Some people bow as a way of simply expressing respect and devotion. Sitting down and settling in, taking a few moments to allow yourself to sit in a comfortable position. Perhaps taking a few breaths. I think in the first session we talked about the practice of 3 deep breaths can be a way of settling yourself. So just some general guidelines. Before we shift gears, does anybody have any thoughts, comments, questions about any of these guidelines? Okay. I have these written up on a handout that I've sent to Jenny by attachment. So if you would like a copy, you could either email her or you can email me. I'd be happy to send one to you. So I'd like to present a model for Christian mindfulness that brings together the 2 aspects of mindfulness that we've talked about. The secular or health-related mindfulness, where the goal is just physical or mental health and well-being, stress relief, just reducing anxiety, just in general feeling better. And Christian mindfulness, where the goal is much more to help us to be aware of the presence of God in every moment. So it begins with considering direct experience. We're going to show layers of experiencing here. Direct experience might be the direct feeling of the breath in the throat or in the body, the rising and falling, the feeling of the taste of food, the experience of when you look at food, simply seeing it, the feeling of a carrot in your hand as you peel it. So the direct experience. And of course, that's one of the things we try to return to in mindfulness practice. And then around that, we can consider a set of thoughts about our direct experience. So for example, I might be sitting and suddenly I notice my stomach is beginning to growl, and it's about 12 o'clock And and the experience then would be that sense of the stomach growling, and then our thought about it would be, ooh, I'm getting hungry. Uh, I'm wondering what's for lunch. And then around that are all the layers of thoughts and interpretation that we would have. So I might follow that with, gee, I think we have some tuna fish in the refrigerator. No, I had that yesterday. Maybe there's peanut butter. I think a peanut butter sandwich would be good. Actually, a salad would probably be better. That would be better for me. And we're off and running. And we all do this. This is one way of thinking about thinking. And then in meditation practice, we realize what we're doing. We start going back. We go back to the direct experience. And then we start having thoughts about it, and we're off and running again. In and out, in and out, in and out, through the entire period of contemplative practice, and for that matter, throughout our day. Most of the time, we are out in that zone of thoughts and interpretation, and sometimes not even aware of what we're directly experiencing. So any thoughts or comments about this? Does this make sense to you? Okay. So it's kind of a process of in and out, directly experiencing, thinking about our direct experience, and then we're off to the races with every other sort of thought. This would be the model of either secular meditation or Christian. Where Christian meditation goes deeper is, and this is taken from Thomas Keating's way of thinking about it, is that beneath our direct experience is what he calls the true self. So as we sit in the experience of the present moment, we sink more and more towards the true self. That self that is not what we present to the world, but who we truly are. And this is taken from a book he wrote entitled Intimacy with God about 20 years ago. And within that true self is what he considers the presence of God, the divine presence, the spark of the divine, if you would, within each one of us. So that the process of centering prayer, or I would suggest Christian meditation or Christian Zen, is more and more allowing ourselves through the experience of the present moment to move more and more towards an awareness of the divine presence within each one of us. Any thoughts about that? Any comments or reactions? Does this make sense to you? Okay. So I think that's all I would like to say about a model. What I hope it pulls together not only the three Christian meditation methods I've talked about, but also bridging between health-related mindfulness practice and Christian mindfulness practice.
Okay, Dr. Herbies, would you explain how long do you think it took you through this progression to get to where you thought you might be experiencing the divine?
Leanne, it depends on the day. There have been times when I have felt like I touched the presence of the divine. For some people, that happens very quickly, a matter of a few times of doing it. Some people never have that explicit sense, but it shows in their actions in the world and in their lives and in their interactions with others that they are working they are operating from a place of compassion and wisdom. And maybe that's the truest test of a contemplative practice, is how we live in the world.
Right. And you know what Thomas Keating would say, it is the intention, as Steve said, behind the practice. So in centering prayer, the intention is to open yourself up to the presence and action of God within. And that is your goal. Your goal is not to get the warm and fuzzies of God's presence. Your goal is to open yourself up to the presence and action of God within. And so he really stresses the difference there. Because if you're just doing it for the warm and fuzzies, that's a fairly self-centered, and self-serving reason, as opposed to if you're open to God being with you and acting within, then that is the root of transformation, and that's what enables you to be a kinder, more loving person in your day-to-day life.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you for that clarification. That was beautiful. Anybody else?
I guess I'll make a comment.
Sure.
I see a lot of truth in the talking about the boats passing by, in that I see them when I'm in a period of contemplation, and the maybe the normal thing is to jump on the boat, even though it seems like in the instructive part of contemplative practice, that's not the thing to do. And sometimes I can get off the boat and sometimes I cannot. But I guess the reason that I started trying this practice is that I thought that God would reveal himself to me in some new and different way, which hasn't happened. But in the slide that you have now, in trying to find the true self and realizing that the true self is God in me, that I can better relate to, and I think I find God in that sense, rather than him revealing himself to me in a new way.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Jenny, any thoughts or comments to either what Denny said or the comment?
Well, I think that, that a lot of these people would agree that, and Thomas Merton, I think, is, the point vierge is that place where the true self and God are together. And that's sort of what you are striving to experience and then to act from. And it's that funny combination of, we can do things to make that more likely to happen. We can't make that happen. And yet by meditating, it's more likely to happen. And so again, it would be looking for the essence of God, not out there, but in here. And it's not a self-centered thing the way it can be, but it's more getting beyond the self, if that makes any sense. So I just think that's beautiful, Denny, what you said.
Yes, yes. Thank you both. Anything else? This is a quote from James Finley, and it may speak to both Denny and Leanne's comments. It's just, as you expand your meditation practice in concert with your faith, however you express that, you will find these divine moments come more often until you are finally awakened to your deepest self, one with Christ. So that is his perspective. And that is from his website, contemplativeway.org. So that's his perspective. So it's about 20 of, and I guess I'd like to just remind us of one of the goals or one of the hopes within contemplative practice, at least formally practice, is that it becomes so much a part of our lives that we can follow that, that it becomes a way to pray without ceasing in the way that Paul instructed the Thessalonians to pray without ceasing, without ceasing. And a quote from Ellen Burks, who I mentioned earlier, from a book that just came out a couple of months ago, is that living fully awake and aware in each moment is prayer without ceasing, which I subscribe to, that simply being fully present in each moment is in itself prayer without ceasing. So that would be my perspective. Jenny, any thoughts or comments? Okay. Anybody else?
I mean, the only thing that I would add is, yeah, I mean, we all talk about God, and we even talk about presence of God, but you know, it's such a subjective thing that are we even talking about the same thing when we use those same words?
Yes.
And prayer is the same thing. You know, the kind of prayer that we're talking about is very different from a verbal corporate prayer when we all join in the Lord's Prayer and saying that together. But it is more like that experience that you talked about, and the experience of God with us.
And one is not, quote, right and the other incorrect. There's simply two different expressions, as you use the term, of ways of reaching out to God.
And one can lead to the other in both ways.
Absolutely. And many people have found that through history, that one can lead to the other. So I'd like to close with just this part of the presentation is a quote from Thomas Merton. I think I showed this once before, and this was certainly a fundamental part of his life experience. That life is this simple, that we are living in a world that is absolutely transparent, and the divine is shining through it all the time. This is not just a nice story or a fable, it is true. And my own hope is for myself that I can come more and more to seeing God as shining through all the time in this world, even in the midst of a pandemic, that the divine is here with us. So, a couple of things about contemplative practice in general. The first is that people who have intrusive thoughts, like PTSD, psychotic symptoms, anything where the mind is, where there's a sense of intrusion, it's probably not a good idea to be closing the eyes and focusing inwardly. People with psychotic symptoms need to be dealing more with the outer world. And so that would be a caution. A second caution is, as we become more present to our actual experience, as we notice more and more our thoughts, our feelings, as they rise and pass and sometimes stay, we may be distressed by what we discover. We will see aspects perhaps of ourselves that perhaps don't fit the way we prefer to think of ourselves. There may be thoughts that are distressing. So that is a caution. And the instruction there is generally notice them. Try to not judge them. Just notice that they're there and allow them to pass by. If they continue to notice them, continue to allow them to be present and let them pass.
Can I add that, right now, I think this is sort of one of the symptoms or the experiences of the pandemic. As many of us are spending so much time by ourselves or with just one or two other people, and many of the distractions that we experience are not available, many people are more aware of themselves, for better and for worse. And so I think that, yes, some people have been distressed by what they found in themselves or in a relationship. And other times we can find something quite beautiful. So that comment, I think, is very, very appropriate and timely.
Thank you. Thank you. And then finally, internal experiences can sometimes be very fascinating. There can be a temptation to seek more of them. And as Jenny pointed out, the intention of a contemplative practice is not to seek out particular experiences, however enjoyable they may be, but there can be a temptation to turn away from the world. And as the expression goes, to sit in navel gazing. This is anything but the orientation of contemplative prayer, because as Amy Oden has said in her book, the marks of Christian mindfulness are enacted through our daily encounters with others. And if mindfulness is not leading us to act in the world with greater clarity towards God's peace, God's shalom, we have to take another look at what we're doing. If mindfulness is not showing up in the way we interact with others in a more loving and compassionate and non-judgmental way, if it's not leading us to act in the world, then it's time to take a look at this. I think Thomas Keating has said that in the practice of centering prayer, the best way to find out whether centering prayer is having an effect on you is to ask somebody else. Ask your spouse, ask your friend. Do you notice a difference? Is anything showing up? And if they say, yeah, you're more judgmental, you're more irritating to be with, and maybe it's time to say, well, maybe this isn't the path for me. So there needs to be a balance, and one needs to be internal mindfulness needs to be balanced and needs to be carried out in the way we interact with the world. Any thoughts on that? Any comments? Okay, I'd like to just, we're about ready to wrap up here. So just some additional resources. Jenny has mentioned the First Church's Contemplative Prayer Group, which, is that correct, Jenny? 12:15 on Tuesdays, when you're not, when we're not in the midst of shutdown. So that is a wonderful resource. There are some other weekly groups around in Oak Ridge. We have a Zoom group at St. Stephen's that meets on Thursday afternoons at 4 o'clock. There are about 5 or 6 of us that gather for a 20-minute sit via Zoom. And if anybody would be interested in joining us, you're more than welcome. Just send me an email and I'll send you the link. First Pres has a group, I think, that meets at 12, it may meet at the same time, Jenny, as yours. Do you? Okay, you think that's the case, yeah. The Oak Ridge Unitarian Church has at least one meditation group. They may have two. And of course, being Unitarians, it would not be focused on necessarily or explicitly on Christian foundations, but they also have a group. There are contemplative retreats offered. St. Mary's at Sewanee, Gethsemane Abbey in Kentucky offers both individual and guided retreats. Both of them have websites. If you're interested in a more extended period of contemplation, either of those are resources. Richard Rohr's daily readings are, for a number of people that I know, very helpful. His website, some of his books, you may have encountered them at first. I don't know if you've, okay, Jenny, I see you nodding perhaps, but.
We have several of them in the library, and several of the small groups have studied some of them.
Oh, okay, okay, thank you. His website is cac.org. That stands for Community for Action and Contemplation, I believe. Jenny, I see you nodding. So
I think that's right. I was wrestling with that one too.
It's very close to that, but I thought it was. I've always thought it was interesting that he puts the action before the contemplation, which I found interesting. Richard Rohr, if you're not familiar with him, he is a Roman Catholic friar who I think some of his teachings are kind of on the fringe of Roman Catholic acceptance, which seemed maybe the fact that he's in New Mexico keeps him out of the spotlight of the Vatican, but many people find his readings very helpful in many different traditions. Let's see, some online resources. If you are interested in the practice of what they call Christian meditation, the first practice that we did, which involves the use of the word Maranatha, that website is wccm.org, stands for World Community for Christian Meditation. The Centering Prayer website is contemplativeoutreach.org, and there are wonderful resources on that website, including rather detailed explanations of the centering prayer process. So I would really encourage you, if you are interested in that particular method of practice, to seek that out. I see Jenny looks like she's looking for something, so.
No.
Okay, I thought perhaps you had a brochure that you were going to show us, but.
I do have a fair amount of stuff about centering prayer from Contemplative Outreach. So those I can make copies of, or else forward probably now is a better option.
Okay, very good. So thank you, Jenny. And Christian Mindfulness, the two websites that the two authors I've mentioned before, Amy Oden, we saw a video of her last week. Her website is amyoden.com. And themindfulchristian.net is the website of Irene Kragel, a clinical psychologist who works at Calvin College in Michigan, and has an interesting blend of I would say sort of evangelical Christian orientation with Christian mindfulness practice. And her website has a lot of good resources. I would encourage you to consider looking at that. So just to wrap up, I hope I've shown that the mindfulness practice is wonderful for so many health benefits, reducing the stress, calming the mind, reducing anxiety. They're especially helpful. It's an especially helpful set of practices for right now as we go through this very challenging time. And again, the most basic mindfulness practice is 3 deep breaths. Whatever you're doing, just stop, take 3 deep breaths. That's a very good way of calming the mind. Both formal and informal practices have value. I've spent probably more time on the formal practices, but simply the informal practices. What some meditation teachers call meditation in action, because we spend a whole lot more of our lives not sitting in silent prayer than we do sitting. And third, that Christian mindfulness, or what Christian authors have often just called prayerful attention, has always been part of our Christian tradition, dating back, certainly back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries with the Desert Fathers and Mothers. And of course, the roots of their practice are found in the New Testament as well. And I didn't get into that, but they are there. And the bottom line for me is that Christian mindfulness practices can lead to a deeper sense of God's presence right here, right now, in this present moment. So before we close, does anyone have thoughts or comments? I'm going to have a couple of final thoughts before I say anything. Does anyone have thoughts or comments?
Yeah. It's the words that come now, old adage, you are what you think.
There make a lot of truth to that. Thank you.
So if you try to keep that within, I keep hearing the positives. The complication is, though we like to feel that God is always positive, that isn't really what we've learned, that if we live the example of Jesus, you expect the end result to be positive, but the way there is not necessarily positive. So that makes it both like you're on an ocean. It's wavy and then calm, and wavy and then calm, and wavy then calming. That's if we keep that in perspective, then perhaps we will be able to float more comfortably and also be productive.
I think that's that image of waves and calm, waves and calm. I think a lot of us could resonate with that, and particularly maybe right now. Anybody else have thoughts or comments? Okay, I'd like to just leave us before we close with prayer. And Jenny, I would hope you would be willing to lead us in that final prayer again.
Thank you.
Some final thoughts. Know why you're practicing. Try to articulate for yourself if you would like to develop a more mindful approach to life. For what reason? Are you simply trying to be more calm? Are you trying to lower anxiety? Are you trying to sleep better? Are you hoping to have a deeper sense of God's love or God's presence in your life? Whatever it is, spend a little time and know why you're doing what you're doing. And begin where you are. If right now you can't imagine sitting still for more than 2 minutes, that is great. Sit still for 2 minutes. Experiment. I've tried to give a number of different techniques. You might consider them as tools. They're tools for one's own spiritual growth, both formal practice and informal. Try different things. See what you find helpful in growing more mindful. And finally, and maybe most importantly, just be gentle with yourself. We are so good at holding up unrealistic expectations for ourselves. So many of us are so well trained in beating ourselves up. So I would encourage you to be very, very gentle. I think Jenny gave the example when we were talking about centering prayer. Jenny, I think you mentioned the woman who came to Thomas Keating and said, I find my mind wandering 1,000 times during my sitting. And Thomas Keating exclaimed, how wonderful, you have 1,000 opportunities to bring yourself back to the presence of God. I may be misquoting.
No, yeah, she said, I'm terrible at this. And he had such a beautiful reframing.
Yes, that every time we're not present, paradoxically, is a wonderful opportunity to be present. So let's close then with Jenny, if you would lead us in the
Be happy to.
Final prayer.
Yes. So let us pray. May I know God's love. May I know God's joy. May I know God's peace. May we know God's love. May we know God's joy. May we know God's peace. May all persons know God's love. May all persons know God's joy. May all persons know God's peace. Amen.